Hello again, everybody out in the world. Hey, I'm talking to myself. I have Miss Producer here with me. But welcome back to our series, Faith, History, and the Craziness of the 21st Century. She just asked me if I wanted to write that down. But I think this is very appropriate, especially in light of, because today is October 8th, and so last night you had the vice presidential debates. A week ago you had the presidential debates, and it really goes as an example of how democracy, small d, gets hijacked. Now, I want you to understand something. When I ask this question all the time to people, when I get into these discussions, and I'll say, okay, how are we as the United States of America governed? And they say, what do you mean? I said, well, what's our basis for government? What's the authority? Who's the authority? I mean, you tell me. And they'll say, well, the President of the United States, and then there's the Congress and the Senate, and then the Supreme Court. I'll say, those are the parts of government. But I said, you're not telling me the authority by which they govern. Then I've got them stumped. And so they say, well, I don't really understand what you're driving at. And I'll tell them, we are a constitutional republic. Our founding fathers, after the American Revolution was fought, our founding fathers went into the process of establishing what kind of government we were going to be. In fact, there were some people who wanted George Washington to be king. Right after the Revolution, they were like, hey, George Washington, be our king. And, you know, I love George Washington. He is a great... I think he was a great man. I think that the hand of God was upon him. I've studied a lot of George Washington. I refer to myself as a George Washington historian because I like George. And he stopped him and said, hey, now hold it. I'm not going to become king. We just spent years fighting a war to get away from a king. Now you want to make me king? I'm not going to do it. He wouldn't have any of it. So the people of the United States, the populace, really didn't know. And of course, then they weren't, they were the United States, but they were a confederation of individual states. And so they really didn't know what to do at that point. And so Congress went into what they called the Constitutional Convention, and they came out eventually with the Constitution as we know it. And so that is what governs us. And hear me out, people. And if you get into political discussions, I know that that's not popular today. Especially if you're a Christian, there are so many people who say, oh, politics shouldn't be in the church. I disagree wholeheartedly. In fact, if I could, I would tell you who to vote for. I know that would get me into a lot of trouble, but I would tell you if I could. Lyndon B. Johnson kind of did away with that. But it used to be during American colonial days that politics were very much a part of the discussions that took place, not only in the community, but in the church as well. And so I don't agree. I agree that the state shouldn't be able to come in and tell the church what they can preach and what they can do and how they can live. But the church, and this is pretty appropriate for today, seeing as how we have a Supreme Court justice being ready to be confirmed. And I've heard so many politicians say, well, how is your faith? How are you going to separate your judgments from your faith? She shouldn't have to. And our founding fathers made that very clear in the Constitution, that she has a freedom. That is who we are. Listen, how do you determine your beliefs? And if you think that Christianity is the only faith in the arena today, you're wrong. Because let's go back. Last time we met, we compared the American Revolution, French Revolution, or French Revolution in academic circles is always held as the epitome of democracy being established. But that is not correct. I will just tell you, if you've heard that in your history class at college, your professor is woefully wrong. Okay? It is not the epitome of the establishment of democracy. In fact, Tocqueville himself, which, if you want to read a good book, read it. I'm reading it again. Tocqueville, really good. Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America. And I'm going to share some quotes maybe in a little while from there. But he even said that in Europe, France, in Europe, the French Revolution was rather the epitome of democracy being established in Europe. But even he says they got it woefully wrong. Because this revolution, this first revolution, only lasted a short while. Who came? Well, let me back up here. So we were talking about Christianity. Christianity, biblical principles were the influence in the American Revolution. But there was a religious influence here. This human philosophy is really secular humanism. And this is where it's really born. Now you get people who say, well, I don't believe that. You don't have to. But once secular humanism was instituted in the education system, even in our country, secular humanism is a religion today. It is the worship of humanity. It is the ability and the belief that humanity is smarter than any god that might be in the Bible. I mean, we are so full of ourselves that we have elevated ourselves to self-worship. And that's really what secular humanism is. And so the French Revolution was influenced by human philosophy, human reasoning, and you remember I drew a comparison with the two. After the American Revolution, those who supported King George weren't drug out of their homes. They didn't have their heads lopped off in the city square. They weren't thrown into prison. There was no repercussions. I'm sure there were hard feelings, but after the American Revolution, you could either stay in the country and be an American and live your life, or you could go across the Atlantic Ocean back to England. And be quite honest with you, some did. Ben Franklin's own son, who had been a governor at one time in the United States, he went over to England and established himself over there, thinking that he would be welcomed with open arms. Really, that's not the way it happened. They kind of, the English really disrespected him and held him in contempt. So it's a sad story. You can read it some other time. But anyway, some did. Some went over to England. Some went to Canada. They went all over the place, but they didn't have to. They could stay, and there was no repercussions. French Revolution, if you supported the king, 1793, they took the king and Marie Antoinette out and laid them down in the city square of Paris and lopped their heads off with a guillotine. And they did that with a lot of people. If you supported the king, you run the risk of being killed, and many were. It was called the Reign of Terror. And so, huge difference. Why didn't the American Revolution, why didn't they handle it that way? Right here. because it was founded in the biblical principles. They weren't just mad wanting to get their own way. This wasn't mob rule here. They were wanting to establish something, and they felt that the cause was a righteous cause, and it was. And Tocqueville says that. Now here, they did it in France because, well, to be quite honest with you, secular humanism allows for that. And if you don't believe that that's still the case today, just talk to somebody about abortion. There's almost 70 million babies that have been aborted, human lives that have been aborted since Roe versus Wade passed. Almost 70 million lives. Secular humanism says human life doesn't matter. You don't agree with us, you're a drag on society, we don't want you, whatever reason, excuse you can come up with, secular humanism does not value human life. And I know that there will be people who, if you share this or whatever, if somebody watches this and disagrees, you're more than welcome to reach out to me through email. But I'm not going to be called names. That's childish. I mean, you can call me names, but if you want to have a discussion, we can have a discussion about this. And so here we have this contrast. And so what was the reasons for the revolution? In both cases, there is, in both the American Revolution and French Revolution, there was a sense of injustice being placed upon the people by the government. And in those cases, monarchies. Okay? And you had in France what was called the bourgeoisie, and they were the middle class. And I'll just be honest with you, when you hear in our society today, in the presidential elections, relief for the middle class, I am all about the middle class. We are the engine that keeps the world running, keeps this nation running. Don't let them fool you. Okay, everybody talks about the 1% and the wealthy and the corporations, and you know, I don't want to get into all that. Are there bad corporations? Yes. Just like they're bad people. Are there bad people? Absolutely. But I'm going to tell you something. The middle class is what's carried this nation for a long, long time. And I'm not saying that not everybody has value. Everybody has value. But the middle class in the French Revolution, the middle class were disgruntled because they had enough money that they could have property, some property. They could own a business. But they had no political clout at all. None. The aristocracy held the political clout. And so they had no say in what was going on in the nations, the laws that were being made. That was still held. And the same was true really in England with the monarchy. You had the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The House of Commons were the gentry folk, and the House of Lords were the nobility. And no one was really representing the common ground. The gentries, the English gentry class, were the aristocratic, wealthy. They had name, they'd been around a long time, they had land, but they didn't have title, noble title. And so, but who was taking care, who was representing really the shopkeeper who ran the printing shop down the street, or the butcher? And you see, they had businesses, but they had no political clout. And the same was true in America. You know, we had the gentry of England was still applied here in America. And so they saw that as an inequality. And it wasn't an inequality of outcome. It was an inequality of rights, of representation. And that's really the number one factor, is they wanted to be represented. We would have never had the American Revolution if George would have said, hey, you guys are right. Let's just redo this thing. You can have some representation. We're going to redo the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and we'll add a third house to that. Because the House of Commons really wasn't the House of Commons. It was the House of Aristocracy. So he could have said, hey, I get your complaint. That's not what he did. And so time and time again, we sent delegation after delegation after delegation before the king, and he just sent them back here. And eventually, with the tax and the impositions that were put upon us, like the quartering of army soldiers. Can you imagine that going over today? And it's still done in parts of this world. Don't get me wrong. But can you imagine this being the case in the United States, which, if the election doesn't go right, could very well happen? That they could march in and say, listen, we like this place. This is a city that's going to be taken over by martial law. And so we are now the mayor and the city council. And so we would like you to leave. And you would say, well, where are we going to stay? And the British soldiers told the families, not our problem. And so families, if they lived on a farm, they'd live out in the barn while the soldiers lived in the house. And so a part of our Constitution, a part of the grievances that the colonials had was, you're coming in, this is our house, we build it with our own hands, and you're just saying it's yours. Do whatever you want with your troops. And they said that we're having enough. No, we're done with it. And so don't get me started, because if you read, especially during the French Indian Wars, the disdain that the British soldiers had for the colonial militia is amazing. That was really when the tensions started between the colonials and the English. There are always grievances. There will always be grievances with government, because listen, we're governed by men. Men are fallible. Men are easily beset upon by corruption. And so it takes work to be, for lack of a better term, incorruptible. Okay? And so, that's one of the things I like about George Washington. The whole country was ready to make him king. He's the guy that stopped it, put the brakes on it, not somebody else. He didn't let somebody else say, oh, no, we can't do that, can we, George? No, he's the first one to say that ain't going to happen. And so he worked hard at maintaining his integrity and his convictions, and that is what you have. And not to say that the people of the French Revolution didn't have convictions. It takes a lot of conviction to drag your neighbor out and lop their head off. So convictions are really what we live our life. And you can have good convictions, you can have bad convictions. It just depends on what they are based on. And if we base our country, national convictions when it was founded were based on biblical principles. The French Revolution's convictions were based on humanistic principles. You see the comparison? And so there's this, it's like a race. Imagine it as a race, and you got a car, and they're zooming ahead of each other. And when it comes down to it, the photo finish of these two, and what has happened over the years of history being revised, is that they've edged out the photo finish for liberal historians and revisionists have edged out the American Revolution by the French Revolution. And so when it comes down to a photo finish, it's close, folks. The American Revolution, French Revolution, it's close. Who's it going to be? Who's it going to be? You know, you love those Kentucky Derby horse races, how they announce that. And it is the French Revolution by a nose, folks. Crazy, isn't it? When really the American Revolution is still the epitome of how democracy in the founding of America should look. A constitutional republic. Democracy with a small d, not mob rule. That's democracy with a big D. And so, having said all that, can you understand why it is important to know how our country was founded? It is extremely important that you and I understand our history. I'm going to get my notes back up here. Got them on my laptop. The second thing is the peasants were acutely aware that their situations were less and less willing to be supported by the feudal system. You know, they had the feudal system. Feudal system said, you know, this baron over here, this noble, had all this land and actually owned towns. And if you lived in that town and you had a bakery, he owned the building that your bakery was in. You were just the baker. And you had to then pay or give some of your money to your feudal lord. You actually lived for his furtherment. And so the peasantry realized that this wasn't working out well for them at all. Now the third thing was that the philosophies had been more widely read in France than in any other part of Europe at that time. French philosophers, I mentioned a few of them last week. You had Descartes, you had Spinoza, and so John Locke, who influenced both American, his readings were read in America as well. Thomas Paine in the American Revolution was huge. When he wrote Common Sense, that just took the colonies by storm. And so you had the French philosophers, and they were well read, widely read, and so now these ideas are starting to become a part of public life. How did that happen in those days? Like in colonial America, you know, they didn't have internet, they didn't have telephone, they didn't have any kind of media that we have today. They had the newspaper, the local newspaper, but people printed pamphlets. If you had a belief, they printed a pamphlet, and they went out and they passed out pamphlets. And because there was no internet, there was no television, there was no radio, anybody who could read was looking for something to read. That's why everybody read the Bible. That is why the Bible was a part of the educational system for a lot of years in our country. In my opinion, it still should be. It would do really well because not only do they get good principles, but it's a vast variety of material that they can read, both poetry, history. And there's a lot of stuff there. So that's kind of what is going on. And so how did that take place? What did that look like? Well, people gathered in town. When you were done working for the day out in the fields and you lived in a small town like Marion here, that what they would do is they'd walk down to the city square. And everybody would then begin to chat. They'd read these plays. Hey, did you read Thomas Paine's Common Sense? Did you pick up that yet? You need to read that. And they would talk like that, and they would carry out, if there was a newspaper, they carried it with them, and they would discuss things. They didn't, I mean, I'm sure they got into arguments, but it wasn't a shut up kind of a thing today like we have in our society. They wanted that discourse, that dialogue with one another, and that really was what propelled the ideas of the American Revolution and the French Revolution. They did the same thing in France, and so and the only place where you could really go in the colonies that everybody went to was the church, and so the church was very much a part of the political center of the American colonies. So you had the next one was the French participation in the American Revolution. I told you last week that the American Revolution really fed into the French Revolution because the French, now the common people, the middle class, the peasants said, hey, if the colonials in America can break away from King George and the most powerful army in the world at the time, hey, why not us? And so the American Revolution played a part in that. Also, the French Navy participated, and the French government gave aid in the American Revolution at some point, closer to the midpoint, near the end. But it still, it probably burdened the government a bit financially. And so the fifth thing was France was one of the most populous countries in Europe. And then you had the issues of crop failures that 1788 saw the year before the revolution actually broke out. And so you had deprivation, starvation taking place. And all of this compounded into a huge restless population that was craving change. So that, along with then the French monarchy, who was no longer seen by the populace as divinely ordained. You see, that's a whole other topic if we were getting discussion. But monarchs were associated very closely with the church, and so the monarchs were considered divinely ordained by God. And so it's kind of, when you have a religious, and France was highly Catholic. They did have some other groups in there, Huguenots and that, which didn't go over very well. And they warred between them, just like in England, the Protestant and the Catholics kind of went at it. But the French monarchy was no longer seen as divinely ordained. And so there was political and societal upheavals at that point. And so we had the French Revolution. And so you have the French Revolution, they depose the king. It's not in the midst of this who rises up to be the star of the French Revolution. Sadie, that was me. Sadie gets excited about history, you can tell. The hero that rises out of the French Revolution is Napoleon Bonaparte. And so he would become a leading figure in the French Revolution, and eventually he would make himself emperor. And so him and Josephine would rule France for a while, and so it becomes pretty apparent that when we look at history, we can see it being replayed right in front of our very eyes. Let me share a couple of things from Tocqueville, because I like what he has to say. And I highlighted these in the book. And so he writes this, and he says, in whatever direction we glance. Now he's writing this about America. He's in America. In whatever direction we glance, we perceive the same revolution in motion throughout the entire Christian world. Everywhere we look, the various events of people's lives have turned to the advantage of democracy. All men have helped in its progress, whether their efforts both those who aim to further its success and those who never dreamed of supporting it, both those who fought on its behalf and those who were its declared opponents. Everyone has driven willy-nilly along the same road, and everyone has joined the common cause, some despite themselves, others unwittingly, like a blind instrument in the hands of God. Then he goes on to say this, can it be that democracy, which has destroyed feudalism and overcome kings, will retreat before the wealthy or the middle class? That's a question. Will it stop now that it has become so powerful and its adversaries so weak? And he goes on to say this, that this thing called democracy, with a small d, is about, he said it's very fragile because it can be abused. And he saw that played out because after the French Revolution, you have Napoleon. And Napoleon takes France into war all over Europe. And actually, France basically controls all of Europe. Napoleon's big mistake was when he went in to fight Russia just in the fall before winter. The greatest ally Russia ever has, the greatest weapon, is winter. And so didn't really do his homework there. But Napoleon is then deposed. And so you have a second revolution within the span of 30 years. They go through two revolutions. And so you can see that this human philosophy, this secular humanism, is very subjective. Whereas the founding principles that the American Revolution took place on, I mean, we're 245 years into it. Are we without struggles? No. Because there are always those who, even in a constitutional republic, and democracy is the word of the day, we're really not a democracy. We've become a democracy in the idea that we want the majority to rule, the 51% to be over the 50%. You see, we want that majority rule rather than having the system that we have today where everybody can vote. Everybody, if you're a citizen of the United States, and I believe only citizens should vote. I've been to different countries in the world, and when I hear this argument about we don't need borders, we don't need walls, that's stupidity once again on parade. Now, I've gone into countries where you get off the plane, they take you into a room, there's a guard standing there with an AK-47 looking like he's wanting to shoot something, and you're the best target available, and then they rifle through your luggage looking for something. I've been in that situation, folks. That's not democracy. But yet they call it democracy because, well, a majority rules. That's not true democracy. A constitutional republic with the kind of democracy that we want, that our founding fathers was about, and this is what Tocqueville makes a point of in his book, is that as he tours the nation, as he tours the United States as a young nation, fledgling nation, he says there is the ability for anyone to own property. That wasn't the case in France. That wasn't the case in fact, all of Europe. Not everybody could own property. And so he looked at this American democracy and he says, they have an equal opportunity. Not necessarily equal results, but they have an equal opportunity. And that's what we fail to realize today. A part of the big argument and discussion that's going on in our nation is that there should be an equal outcome. The distribution of wealth. But there are some people, let's face it, there are some people who just work harder than others. There are some people who have to learn through the school of hard knocks how to make the right decisions in handling a small amount of wealth, let alone a great amount of wealth. And so the basis of a free market, that is what our country was founded on. And I tell you what, they felt so strongly about this that George Washington and the Continental Congress at the time, they said, listen, we're not going to get involved in Europe's affairs. They knew what was happening in France. We were still a fledgling country when the French Revolution broke out. Do you think that France quite possibly said, hey, you think the monarch said, hey, come on over and give us a hand. We gave you a hand. Right early on, George Washington and the leadership of our nation said, we're just starting out as a nation. We are not going to get involved in all of the issues that are taking place in Europe. We're not going to do that. We will trade with them, we'll do commerce with them, but we're not going to go and get involved in their wars. That is not the kind of alliances that they built. Okay? And so this is the idea of, and people today call it isolationism. But to our founding fathers, it was just minding our own business. Just minding our own business. They have leaders, and once you get involved and embroiled in the politics of some other nation's life and direction and destiny, they realized you're going to get yourself in a ton of trouble. And so they just made this blanket statement, sent it out to England, to France, to all of Europe, to the world. We're not messing with other nations. We're going to establish ourselves as a nation and mind our own business. And that had been a policy that had been challenged many times during the course of our nation's history. Of course, after World War II, that has not been our policy by and large. So if you're asking the question right now, are you an isolationist? Do you believe in isolationism? I believe in the historical idea of being very careful in what we embroil ourselves in around the world. That's a very diplomatic way of putting it. It's not about isolationism. It's about choosing the mountains you're willing to die for. And there are some mountains that if I was a political leader would not be willing to die for. And I think we've hurt ourselves by getting embroiled in too many other nations' politics and economics and their issues. Now, that's just my opinion. You can believe what you want. Those are just my convictions. Do I think we have an obligation to help others? Absolutely. We're the most generous nation in the history of mankind and in the world today. When a tsunami hits Japan, when a tsunami hits the Philippines, we're giving. We are the most giving nation in the world. And yet we still get hammered by organizations like the United Nations about we need to be giving more. And I tell you what, the American people, it is in our DNA to be neighborly. I'm just, you don't have to believe it, but I know it to be true. And I can take you back through history and see that. There are a lot of nations that is not the case. And so looking at these two histories, you can actually see a stark contrast, or at least you should. Now let me ask you today, do you see a stark contrast today in our nation? We have two parties. We have the Republican Party and the Democrat Party. It's not the Democratic Party, it's the Democrat Party. Let's get that straight. Okay? Democratic is a process. Democrat is a title, is a category. So you have the Republicans, you have the Democrats. Which, by the way, George Washington, you want to read an inspiring analysis of the nation, almost prophetic. In his farewell address after his second term in office, George Washington said he believed that the two-party system would destroy America, that would destroy the republic. Why? Because it will divide the citizens. And that is exactly what we're living out today. We have a two-party system that both parties need to have some drastic things change within them. Okay? And it's become, the political side of this has become so entrenched in its own self-interest that they can't see, very few can see beyond the little bubble of Washington, D.C. that they live in. And so it's not about the United States anymore. We are just votes to be manipulated. Okay? And we need a resurgence of integrity in the office. And by the way, many people ask me, how can it change? I have a couple of ideas, probably none of them you would like, but there are some things that are going to need to be done. And we're going to have to see some tough decisions made by the people of the nation, not the leaders of the nation, the people. You know what we have now? We have a system right now. You have the judicial system, you have the legislative system, and you have the executive branch. Okay? And if you want to be involved in any one of these things, and in this one we have the House, we have the Senate. Okay? And if you want to be a senator or a legislator, we now have a political aristocracy. This is just like the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And just about every one of these people that serve in this legislative branch are lawyers. See, my dog doesn't really, you say lawyer, that dog gonna bark. Yeah, see? So we have our own political aristocracy now. It takes millions of dollars to become a congressman or a senator. And if you're going to be a judge, man, it used to be you couldn't be political and be a judge. Now, that has become a political activist arm of whatever party belongs to. So you see the problem. George Washington was right. The executive branch, what can you say? They just get rolling and they gotta leave office. And I shared this before, but I think it was 1953. I think I'd have to check that. 1953 or 1951. The House and the Senate passed legislation to limit the terms of office of the presidency of the United States. Now when they did this, they did it by means of a amendment to the Constitution. They amended the Constitution. And when they did that, they did it the right way, what they did was unconstitutional, in my opinion, because now you have an imbalance of the powers. These people here, they can be in 40 or 50 years. These guys are in for a lifetime. Wow, that's a good gig. This guy's in at max 8 years. Because they said, well, it could create too much power in one branch of office. Well, so they limit the terms of the presidency, but they don't limit the terms of the legislature, and they don't put a mandatory retirement age on the judicial system, the Supreme Court justices. So who do you think wields more power in this little illustration here? Who do you think wields the most power? You think the president is the most powerful man when they say he's the most powerful man in the world? No, he's not. The political aristocracy is the most powerful body of people in the world. Presidents come and go. Unfortunately, some of these guys are there way too long. Same for the justices. And so you see the problem that we face as a nation, the uphill battle. When they did this, they put an imbalance to power. You know what would have been great is if they would have had the integrity when they did this to limit the president's terms of the presidency's office. They would have said, you know, if we're going to let him have 2 terms, then legislature, Congress and Senate can only serve 2 terms. And put a mandatory retirement age on Supreme Court justices. Now, that's just my opinion. There are people who would argue against that, saying that it lacks continuity. You know, we gotta be able to maintain the continuity of the government. But if we were teaching the proper history of our nation and the history of the world without bias to one side or the other, if we were teaching this, and if we were still teaching government as a process rather than as a political propaganda, if we still had civics classes in school that taught junior high kids how the whole governmental process in the United States worked, we wouldn't have to worry about the continuity of government because, hey, the common person with common sense, as Thomas Paine would say, can be a part of this process. So we have an uphill battle as that's before us. And we can, I tell you what, as a minister, biggest thing that you can do for the nation is pray. We have a lot to ask God to forgive us for. The Bible says, if my people, which are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways and repent, then will I hear from heaven and I will restore their land. I will heal their land. That is an important thing to remember. We need to pray for our nation. We need to pray for our president. We need to pray for these people in the House and the Senate. We need to pray for these Supreme Court justices, that they would be, and I'll just say it because I can. You don't have to like it. They need to be godly people. Oh, Pastor Jeff, you can't do that. You can't endorse. Yes, I can, because our founders founded the nation. We are a nation founded on biblical principles, not human philosophy. So therein is the lesson. That endeth the lesson. Meet me next week. We're going to be talking about something different. This is going to go away, and we're going to be talking about some other things. The Tocqueville book will be on the link in the description below, and you can check that out. I encourage you to read it. It is a really interesting book, and the neat thing about this is that it is both his essays. Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, toured the nation of the United States as a fledgling nation, and he wrote down and journaled everything that he did. This was a big hit, by the way, in France. Everybody was reading this. And he wrote the first essay, and then a few years later he wrote the second essay on it. I encourage you to read it. You can get it just about anywhere. And Tocqueville can be taken out of context just like everybody else. I've seen liberals and conservatives quote Tocqueville. But I'll tell you what, you can't read Tocqueville without understanding that he saw there was a definite intertwining of the Christian faith and the democracy that he witnessed in the fledgling nation that we call the United States of America. He absolutely says in here that is one of the most prominent elements that he has seen in the success of our nation at this time. And I think it's still going to be the success of it. And we shouldn't shy away from that as Christians. We should embrace it. In fact, we should cheer it, promote it, and advance it, because that is the truth. So, see y'all next week, and be sure to tune in for a different lesson on history and our faith, history, and the craziness that is the 21st century. You're living it. So